The first season of Star Trek Picard is behind us. Much has been said about it already, and plenty more will be said. But I am of the opinion that the series which could and should have been the revitalization that Star Trek needed, ended up being yet another nail in the coffin of a once great franchise. In this post-mortem of sorts, I will begin by establishing how this modern iteration of Star Trek differs from classic Trek, and using some select examples, demonstrate how that has manifested itself in Picard. Then I'll address the immense shortcomings of the finale, and why this was a waste of opportunity for Star Trek as a whole. Star Trek today is a franchise where the fan base has been fractured, and a major cause for this fracture is the handling of politics. Now, I know what the great defenders among you will say. Star Trek was always political, it was always woke, if you will. We just didn't notice before, or some variation thereof. To that, I respond, not quite. Star Trek was always political. This is true, and that is good and well. There is no shortage of examples of this in the original series, which dealt with both racial issues, social issues, and tensions in times of war. On top of that, the Next Generation era dealt with both what it means to be human, matters of reason versus faith, and much, much more. One of my go-to examples is from the original movies. By way of allegory, Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country dealt with the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl and the subsequent fall of the Soviet Union. At its core, that movie was about learning to move on from decades of hostilities, of both sides letting the hurt, mistrust, and resentment go and move towards building a new future. Maybe not as friends, that would be pushing it, but no longer as enemies, and that's a start. This theme was also recurring in the contemporary reunification on The Next Generation, where Romulans and Vulcans learned to overcome their history of hostilities. Not on a societal scale, that would have been blind optimism, which Star Trek never dealt in, but at an individual level, sowing the seeds for long-term societal change. In reality, change takes time, so one step at a time is the way to go. So yes, Star Trek was always political. More specifically, it was humanist. In being humanist, it would, on occasion, take shots at ideological positions either side of the political aisle held dear. But it would do so from a humanist point of view, through the use of fictionalized rewritings of real-world events and situations. Other times, it would get its message across using entirely fictional events, but these had real-world implications and applications, thereby revealing why some, at first glance, enticing positions might not have moral footing, let's say, upon further scrutiny. In taking this approach to politics, Star Trek was universal. It always had a place for everyone, regardless of gender, ethnicity, nationality, religion, or political affiliation. Star Trek was a standard against which everyone, no matter where on the political aisle they stood, could compare their own beliefs and convictions, and perhaps see some matters in a light they hadn't seen before. That way, Star Trek could lead to change within the individual, sowing the seeds for long-term change in society, one step at a time. And this can't be stressed enough. No matter who you were, no matter what you believed, Star Trek didn't judge you. It gave you the opportunity to see the error of your ways. As such, Star Trek of old was universal. It was humanist. It no longer is. Under the helm of Alex Kurtzman, Star Trek has become partisan. It no longer unifies, it divides across partisan, ethnic, and ideological lines, and then proceeds to preach to the choir. If you don't in advance agree with the ideo-political positions the current showrunners hold, there will be no attempt to show you the error of your ways, as it were. Instead, you will be judged, right in your face. On-screen by this iteration of Star Trek, and off-screen by its creators. Case in point, In an interview, Alex Kurtzman stated that he would rather Trump supporters not watch his iteration of Star Trek, presumably because in his eyes, they're beyond redemption. As the more perceptive of you may have noticed, I am not American, and squabbles along the American partisan divide is a fight in which I do not have a dog, and I certainly don't get a vote. I'm merely an outside observer looking into that circus, and with that hat, I will say that instantly dismissing what makes up half or more of Star Trek's core audience as essentially deplorables is antithetical to what Star Trek has always been about. Kurtzman evidently isn't the only one unclear about that. In a more recent interview with Variety, Michael Chabon, who replaced Alex Kurtzman as showrunner on Picard midway through Season 1, said, "To the extent that I was aware of the kind of toxic fandom, the anti-SJW, sad little corner of fandom, you just disregard that. Sometimes you're motivated to have things simply because it's possibly going to piss off or provoke people who seem to have missed the memo about just what exactly Star Trek is and always has been all about." This statement shows that Chabon also doesn't understand what Star Trek always has been all about. In labeling what he considers a sad little corner of fandom as toxic and anti-SJW, he by implication labels himself and this iteration of Star Trek as SJW. Let me stress that Star Trek was never SJW. Do not confuse humanist, which is what Star Trek was, with the authoritarian offshoot that has hijacked the term social justice today. On that note, Star Trek was also never woke, because wokeness involves an ideopolitically driven narrative of perceived injustice and oppression, and that perception is sometimes at odds with reality and recorded history. Worse yet, it divides the populace by their level of perceived victimhood, and rather than seeking equality, it more often than not revolves around turning the tables on the perceived oppressor. What that means is that the showrunners run the risk of using a partially fictionalized and fully divisive narrative as the starting point for the underlying message of their brand of Star Trek. Now, this is where the screaming choir will go nuts and claim that the so-called toxic fans are just problematic white males who are annoyed because women and people of color are suddenly pushed to the forefront, because as they would say, to the privileged, equality feels like oppression. No, that is your partisan ideology talking right there. The fact of the matter is that the toxic fans, as Chabon calls them, don't have any issues with either women or people of color. In fact, many of those toxic fans just so happens to be women and people of color themselves. The problem is that Star Trek is no longer universal or humanist. Case in point, look to the Orville. It has diversity, it explores social issues, including transgender issues, but it does so in the way that Star Trek did before, meaning it does it from a humanist point of view. And lo and behold, the very fans that Chabon would deride as toxic and anti-SJW love the Orville and are counting days for Season 3. So clearly, the issue isn't representation or diversity, but rather the overarching narrative in which it is employed. The toxic ones here aren't the fans who object to a narrative that Chabon even admits is intentionally divisive, but the creators who made it that way. Thanks to the likes of Alex Kurtzman, Michael Chabon, and other enablers in their echo chamber, Star Trek today is no longer humanist, but fully partisan and ideologically driven. The creators of Star Trek today wear their party affiliation on their sleeve and fully infuse their political platform into Star Trek. As a result, Star Trek has become something it never was before, a propaganda tool. We see this clearly in Star Trek Picard. Even before it premiered, Patrick Stewart and the showrunners let the world know what Star Trek Picard really was. An activist statement on Donald Trump as president of the US, on Brexit, on immigration, and even on Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister of the UK. Now, to be clear, these topics themselves are all good and well for Star Trek to cover, no issues there. The problem is how it's done, namely in the form of an activist statement. That means there is no actual exploration of the issues at hand. There is no digging into the conditions which led to the people voting for Trump and for Brexit respectively, let alone into the people's motivations and reasons for doing just that. None of those were accidents, but I guess a genuine exploration of that might have been too painful for the writers. Because here there is plenty of preaching, but no questioning of the writer's own firmly held convictions, or what these convictions could lead to if seen to their full conclusion. So, what we end up with is an activist statement in which the writers and creatives in charge take for granted that their own political position on these subjects is self-evidently right and in no need of any kind of critical spotlight, yet they lash out at the other side. On screen, this translates to what amounts to incoherent rambling. Examples of this are countless. So let's restrict ourselves to a select few and begin with one from the very first episode. As the star of the Romulan Homeworld went supernova, Starfleet promised to save the Romulans, their historic enemy. However, an attack on Mars by rogue androids, or synthetics as they're called now, resulted in the destruction of the entire armada that Starfleet was building for the explicit purpose of evacuating the Romulan homeworld's inhabitants. So that rescue armada was gone. In response, Starfleet banned synthetics and reneged on its promise to aid the evacuation of Romulus, prompting Picard to resign and retire to his vineyard, since he had personally promised some Romulans here and there that Starfleet would come to the rescue. Starfleet hadn't lived up to what he promised, and that made him bitter and angry, because Starfleet should have helped the Romulan refugees. Hammering in that point, we later see a pocket of Romulans that were evacuated to a planet full of resources, but who remained bitter and angry at Picard over Starfleet not coming back to give them some more handouts, as if that was somehow Picard's fault. The message is clear though. We should have helped. That is, however, the only thing which is clear. Remember how I said that in Star Trek of old, they would sometimes explore a theme using an entirely fictionalized event, but nonetheless ensure it had real-world implications and applications? Well, there is none of that here, because this situation is so far out that there are absolutely no real-world parallels, and therefore no real-world applications to be taken away from this. We are not dealing with a lesser developed civilization that was torn apart by war or natural disaster and that has nowhere else to go or anything like that. Instead, we are dealing with the Romulan Star Empire, who are as or more developed than the Federation. You can't apply that to Syria or any other underdeveloped location on our world. A real-world parallel to this is something you'd have to make up. Like if California suddenly was hit by a massive earthquake and sunk underwater, or the Yellowstone caldera erupted, or something else which rendered a part of the US uninhabitable. But even if that were to happen, I very much doubt that Americans would sit idly by and expect China or Russia to save them, let alone rehouse them. Because there are plenty other worlds in the Romulan Star Empire already. The series then proceeded to show two Romulans happily working in servitude in Picard's household. But beyond that, it didn't address any issues with integrating a proverbial refugee Romulan population, or any societal ripple effects that might result from that. Instead of any such exploration, which might have induced some level of cognitive dissonance, the creative settled for angrily preaching to the viewer, "We should have helped." Which goes back to my initial point. Without any real-world parallel or application, we are left with incoherent rambling, and there is more of that going around. After, 8 or so episodes of pure filler, the confirmation comes. It was the Romulans themselves that instigated the rogue synth attack, which led to the Federation banning the synths. That also means that the Romulans themselves were responsible for the destruction of the armada Starfleet were building to rescue them. But hey, the writers can't be expected to develop something as significant as that, not when there is more preaching to do, or rather, incoherent rambling to blurt out. In the latter part of the series, we learn that banning research on and development of synths was a mistake, because the writers say so. Never mind that Elon Musk says developing too advanced AI is literally summoning demons. Never mind that Stephen Hawking says AI could be the worst event in the history of civilization. Never mind that even great writers like Asimov, who is referenced on screen no less, had to institute the 3 laws of robotics to make AI even remotely safe in his robot stories. And never mind that Frank Herbert banned making a machine in the image of a human mind in Dune. Never mind any of that. These writers have decreed that we shouldn't have banned synths. The price to pay for doing so was the death of Riker and Troy's firstborn child, which they incredibly sat passively by and allowed to happen. That's very out of character for them. If this were the next generation, they would have hunted down Lore, or kidnapped B4, or sought out Dr. Soong, or something, anything, but not with these writers. Be that as it may, in this series we eventually learn that while the Romulans have terrible timing, they surely could have waited with instigating that rogue synth attack until after the Armada had left to rescue their people. But they were nonetheless entirely justified in doing what they did. Because the Romulans knew from the best teacher of all, namely history, that every single time a civilization develops too advanced AI, the machines will inevitably rise against their masters. They even said so in Battlestar Galactica. All of this has happened before. All of this will happen again. Worse yet, somewhere out there exists this super advanced, super dangerous, nigh unstoppable machine intelligence which is intent on finding and nurturing any advanced AI that arises, all while eradicating the civilization that created it. And they can be summoned. Even Soji, poor innocent sweet Soji, who up until 3 minutes ago thought she was a human, who Riker made pizza, who Riker's daughter embraced and gave a compass, and who that whole ragtag crew went to great lengths to rescue, turned on all of them and became hell-bent on destroying all life in the galaxy at the flick of a switch. Took Picard dying to snap her out of it, but even then she had already alerted this super dangerous nigh unstoppable AI of our existence and location. Soji may be the destroyer yet. Those Romulan predictions were spot on, gotta hand it to their Nostradamus. For the time being it ends well though, because the evil Romulans, who wanted to save us all, blinked, and the Federation lifted the ban on synths, so there will be many more ticking bombs among us. Wait, how was this a good ending? And what real-world lesson are we to take from this? That I leave to you to interpret. But through the rambling, the writers are telling us that banning synths or being suspicious of them is wrong, even if every last one of them poses a potential threat to our continued existence. To be a good person, you should balance on the edge of that knife, ignore the clear and present danger, and live by the words, "Nah, it'll be fine." In the end, Picard dies, sacrificing himself, so Soji will delay snapping till another day. But the writers graciously used this opportunity to give Picard and Data the final farewell they hadn't gotten in Star Trek Nemesis. Something they really congratulated themselves for in the media, all while fawning over their own brilliance. So yeah, good going, wasting an entire season concluding a storyline from a movie no one saw 20 years ago, and that they already had resolved, in a much more satisfying way I might add, in Countdown, the comic book prequel to the 2009 movie. But I guess they forgot about that. even if Alex Kurtzman himself had story credit on it. What made it even more pointless, though, is that Picard never got that farewell, and neither did Data. Because according to this series, Data really died in Star Trek Nemesis. Despite all the fragments of him that may have survived, he did not. Data is gone. It was a reconstruction of his memories that got the final farewell with Picard. Only that wasn't Picard, because Picard is dead and gone too. His life and his soul had already expired. What met the copy of Data was a digital copy of Picard, put in an equally frail body as before. So keep that in mind for Season 2. You are no longer seeing the Picard you grew up with. That Picard is dead and gone. And no matter how many copies of him they make, the real deal will forever remain dead and gone. From here on out, we are dealing with a copy of him. This series was a hard watch for me. Unlike Star Wars and Doctor Who, I actually am a fan of Star Trek, and I want to see that franchise thrive. In its current form, it does anything but. I see the Kelvin movies as their own thing, and in my own head canon, I can pretend Discovery never happened. But Picard, I can't ignore. It was the first step into the future of Star Trek we've seen since Nemesis, and they blew it. Where it should have been razor sharp, it was dull. Where it should have been poignant, it was rambling. The return of Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, and the rest of the original crew should have been the fuel injection that brought Star Trek back to its previous heights. Instead, under the helm of these writers, it turned out to be yet another nail in the coffin of a once great franchise. And that hurts. Let me know your opinion on all of this, and on Season 1 of Picard, in the comments.